Bloober Team has really made a name for itself as it lives and breathes within the horror genre. This independent developer provides high production presentation and mixes it in with gameplay that one might expect to find in an old point-and-click adventure game. Their games have a lot of puzzle solving mixed in with some exploration, and at times investigative elements. I really enjoyed these elements as they were presented in The Observer. Visually, they create compelling worlds that really invite the player in, which means that the story and visual storytelling are at the forefront of their projects. But they had an idea for a psychological horror game that could not be fully realized on modern consoles until the Xbox Series X and PS5 had entered into the picture. They wanted to tackle a supernatural story that could fully render two environments at the same time, and they did not want to sacrifice their vision to make this happen sooner. So once the technology finally reached up to their ambition for their idea, Bloober was able to achieve just this. Join me as we take a look back at the medium. Layers of Fear was the studio's first attempt at a horror experience, and represented a shift for the studio. They really enjoyed the horror genre and wanted to continue to explore more of it. After the first Layers of Fear, they wanted to focus on providing more disturbing and psychological themed horror. The aim was to make slow-building, tension-filled games with a lot of attention placed on a cinematic story. Bloober Team had a taste for storytelling, and they really wanted to make more of their games focused on it. This was continued with The Observer, a rich cyberpunk horror story with added elements of dialogue options and choices. This eventually led to working on a project based on the Blair Witch film, and eventually partnering with Microsoft for a completely original idea. Early on in Bloober Team's life, they had an idea of using a gameplay mechanic that would have a split-screen effect. Essentially, the player would control one character, but she would be in two different areas. This meant to get this to work, the developers would need to render two completely different environments at the same time. This would require a lot of computing power to fully realize this idea for a potential game. Once the Unreal Engine 4 came out, they found out that a heavily modified version of this engine could be used to make this idea happen. And since the developers wanted to make this playable on both consoles and the PC, the studio felt that with the Xbox Series X and PS5 generation, that those could handle what they were trying to do. Bloober also wanted to tell a story with this dual perspective, to match the gameplay mechanic. The narrative would focus on a medium who is shaped by two worlds, the real and the spirit. The developers were very excited about this story idea since both perspectives would allow for a lot of environmental storytelling.
You know, I promised myself once I would never let anything happen to you, not while I'm around.
I'll be fine. I promise.
Risky stuff, then. Huh? All right?
All right, Jack. Now, get some rest.
I need...
The medium story would be rooted in psychological horror. The team was not interested in creating a slasher or jump scare experience. This would be a story that would make the player think about the nature of evil. The writers wanted the players to be asking a lot of questions on who the actual bad guy is, or if there even was one. The cast would feature people who had troubled pasts that helped to shape them into who they are now. Essentially, the goal was to create a layer of gray to the cast, and not have a direct line for good and evil. To help create more mystery to the narrative, the player would interact with different spirits, and one of the recurring ones would be a character named Sadness. She had a mask on her face, and after this point, the studio felt that all of the ghosts that the player interacted with should have the same visual design for their face. This would also be part of the process for our hero to helping the spirits to pass on. The universal use of the mask helped to visually show how the player did not know anything about them, just like the character in the game. The medium story would feature two protagonists, Mary Marianne is strong-willed with a good heart, and Thomas, who is like a wild beast. This would be reflected in their visual designs while in the real and spirit world. To go along with this, everything was built with duality in mind. From the two different worlds, two distinct art styles for the real and spirit, along with the two versions of our characters. From a gameplay perspective, it would focus on investigating areas, solving puzzles, along with a stealth element related to survival. As a medium, the player will have some abilities that can aid them. The studio had a history with making first-person games, and this would be the first switch to third-person. When they decided to go forward with the use of the dual-screen mechanic, they felt that it would not work to the same effect from a first-person viewpoint. In first-person, you were restricted to what the player sees, but for the medium, the player would be able to see what his character sees in two different planes of existence at the same time. Since there would be many segments that would offer a split view, the player wouldn't need to worry about the camera, and they could focus more on what they needed to do in one world that might affect the other. Along with this, during playtesting, players became nauseated when Bloober was toying around with allowing the player to control the camera, and this control ultimately took away from the targeted experience. The developers said that the camera should be used in a way to allow the player to clearly distinguish between the two worlds. The fixed camera and the two distinct art styles helped to achieve that vision. While there would be sequences of more action-focused gameplay, this was not going to be the focus of the game. The action would be used to help to punctuate a story beat. Marianne's supernatural powers are more focused on defense, and the action sequences would be tailored more towards that feeling of survival. The composer of Silent Hill was brought on to provide the soundtrack for the game. Bloober Team had the opportunity to meet with Akira at the Tokyo Game Show, and then were fortunate enough to show him the demo for the medium, and he was sold after that. It is important to note too that the spirit world in this game is heavily influenced by the Silent Hill series. The developers saw the medium as an evolution for the studio. They were trying to push what they could do and present a completely different horror experience than their prior titles. The medium started out as an early idea for rendering dual realities. This was the foundation for the project. The studio's major obstacle was how current hardware at the time could not do what they wanted to achieve. Once it did, Bloober Team dove headfirst into making a psychological horror experience. The use of a real world and spirit would be one of the most interesting aspects about the gameplay. The player would be able to interact with both worlds at the same time. The shift from first person to third for the studio was a big change, and one that ultimately allowed the developers to realize this dual gameplay. In January 2021, the medium was released to the world. The Medium is a story-driven title with the bulk of its gameplay rooted in a point-and-click adventure game. With it having a large focus on its story, it also delivers on that front with an engaging supernatural mystery that tackles some heavy subjects. The non-linear storytelling aids the narrative in making the good story presented on an even more engaging platform. The best aspect about the gameplay comes from the investigation aspects, as you explore the environment and rooms to find clues to figure out how to unlock your path forward. The puzzle solving never becomes hard, but it mostly provides a nice moderate amount of challenge with some satisfying aha moments. There are other forms of gameplay like short stealth segments, running action sequences, and these are mostly decent, but an area that could have been improved upon to add some more depth. The Medium is a really good linear story-driven game that stays with you.
That day when the phone rang, it was the hardest day of my life. The day I went home to say goodbye to my father, to dress him up for his last journey, put him in a suit, fix his tie. Simple. Just the things he did every day. But looking through his stuff wasn't easy. I needed a moment to pull myself together.
The medium operates like a point-and-click adventure game. The beginning area does a good job of showing you how the controls work, the presentation of the fixed camera angles, interacting with the environment, along with some of the future puzzle solving and how it functions. And when it comes to the gameplay, the light exploration and the investigation elements provided in the puzzle solving are the best aspects about the gameplay. Many times you will enter into an area and need to figure out how you can proceed to get to the next location. This allows you to soak in the atmosphere, interact with different objects, along with figuring out what needs to be solved here. What will aid you in this process is the use of your insight. This will allow you to interact or see different things within the environment, like a hidden switch, or a piece of information that is hidden among other things. The insight can be used to provide you with echoes of the past, as you scan items and get a brief taste of what happened before you arrived. At set points within the game, the screen will split into two. On one side it will represent the real world, and on the other it will be the spirit world. Visually this is pretty cool, but it's also used for some of the investigation mechanics as well. For example, you may need to get past a door in the real world, but there is no power going to the door, and you will need to use the spirit world to unleash an energy blast to open it for you. Some of these can get really interesting later in the game, like using a clock within the real world to rewind time in the spirit. While in the spirit world, you will have some supernatural related powers. You can absorb energy at set points to be used to clear paths, or create a shield to protect yourself. There are points within the game where you come to a pathway that is closed in the real world, but open in the spirit. This is where you can have an out-of-body experience, and the game shifts to having you only control your spirit form. You have a limited amount of time to do what you need to do in this form. Outside of the investigation type stuff, there are other gameplay segments. There are a handful of stealth sequences where you need to avoid being detected by a big monster. These mostly become a game of trial and error if you're having a hard time with them. The tension is high during these situations, not because of the gameplay, but rather because of the presentation and the creepy voice of the monster. The other segments are more like quick bursts of action where you need to run away from the monster. While these sequences are very simple, I mostly enjoyed them. The best of them comes in later on when you are being chased, and during the chase it's switching between the real and spirit world. The first half of the game is very interesting when it comes to the gameplay, since you are continually being introduced to new mechanics from the spirit world, stealth, the out-of-body experience, and running sequences. While the second half does not really introduce many new mechanics, the investigation side of things gets some cool uses with how the player is interacting with both the real and spirit world. When it comes to the flaws within the gameplay, I only had a few. Some of the running sequences feel like they have some fake out moments to cause a first time player to die pretty easily. The stealth really comes down to trial and error, and I think the game could have benefited from having some more options for either the stealth, action sequences, or both. They mostly all operate the same. In fairness, the game does offer some interesting action parts, with some problem solving, like one sequence where you need to use your out of body experience to get past the monster and distract him, while you use your real form to turn on a switch to electrocute him. But this is only ever used once, and I think more action sequences that acted like these mini puzzle areas would have been a lot better. And lastly, I think the checkpoints could have been just a bit better. They seem to bring you back just a bit too far, where you need to repeat some of the same story parts or dialogue to get back to where you were. The variety is appreciated in the gameplay, and the investigation stuff is where it shines the most. Now on to the story. Overall, the medium features a really good story. The first short introduction area does an effective job of hooking the player in and getting us invested in our protagonist. Marianne works at a funeral home, and she needs to make the final arrangements for her adoptive father, while also helping him pass on in the spirit world and allowing her to say goodbye. It is in these beginning moments we get to see how the presentation of the medium excels. The camera work is really engaging and knows how to linger just long enough for us to take in all the details. Once she receives a phone phone call from a mysterious person that tells her that he knows more about the nightmare that she has been continually having. This is where the main narrative truly starts. It is at this point that Marianne takes a back seat within the story, shifting towards the main investigation. The mystery is continually interesting and covers some heavy subjects. We see acts of abuse that a person can do, and then we get to explore how that person was even capable of committing those terrible acts. The game does not use these moments to justify or defend the person's actions, but rather shows how a traumatic childhood could negatively affect an adult into making horrible choices in the future. It shows the danger of the cycle of abuse, along with how it can continue. At about the midway point, the game focuses on both the main mystery and how Marianne is related to all of it from a personal side of things. She is a good foil to many of the other characters who do awful things, since her childhood is rather traumatic, but she is a force for good. The story is really good, and the storytelling strengthens the delivery of it. We experience most of the narrative through Marianne's eyes, along with elongated flashbacks as we play as another character. There are also interesting segments where she is talking directly to the player, which is then revealed later on to be a character you meet towards the end. The visual design is solid as well, from the spirit world, along with when you go inside someone's body and see the visual representation of their actions. On the whole, I really enjoyed the narrative and Marianne as the lead. I do find myself very torn on the ending. The medium concludes with an ambiguous cliffhanger, and while having an open ending can work, there still needs to be satisfying closure, especially if there is no sequel planned. Considering that there is a lot of open plot threads, and the game made back its money within the first week, I think we are eventually going to see a sequel, or at least I hope so. Now, if we were in a situation where the story provided more answers to our questions, I could see an ambiguous ending being a good idea for this, but the medium leaves a lot of stuff open, and while we don't need to know everything, we need more than what was provided here, especially if we are not getting a sequel. The ending does not work in providing closure, but it is more effective as a cliffhanger for an eventual part 2. I do like aspects about the ending, especially with how it leaves you wanting more, but I think my final opinion on this will happen once a sequel comes out or not. I am really conflicted on this area of the game. If we never do receive a sequel, the story still is very good. One other thing I want to make note of is that if we do get a sequel, I want the writers and developers to find the right balance between providing us with closure and explanation, but not over-explaining everything to the point that there's no mystery left. I understand that this is a difficult balance, and I hope they can succeed with it. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to mention and praise the soundtrack. The presentation from the captivating visuals to the engaging soundtrack are huge strengths to this game. Here are a few tracks from the game. The Medium is an underrated game. As a story-focused point-and-click throwback title with an interesting split-screen mechanic, it greatly succeeds. The investigation aspects are my favorite parts about the gameplay, whether I am investigating one world or two at the same time, and seeing how they interconnect. There are some good uses of this mechanic, and it does not feel like a cheap gimmick either, especially with how the narrative explores the same duality. I liked Marianne, and the introduction effectively pulled me in and got me invested in her. The story was an engaging mystery, and while I am still torn about the ending, I do hope that we get to see a proper sequel one day. The presentation from the visual design and storytelling to the music are all great. This is easily one of 2021's most interesting games, and one that I would highly recommend. If you are interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description. And thank you very much for watching.